And I think we're recording now. So we'll just make a start with today's session. I'm appreciative of you guys being so willing to let me record this session for anyone who couldn't join us at the same time. I know that these asynchronous classes are challenging like that there's a lot of plans that people have going on. So having these live sessions might be sometimes a challenge. So I really, really do appreciate you being here. I do have a plan for today's session. What I was hoping to do was, and you should be seeing my PowerPoint screen. If for some reason you're not seeing it, just give me a shout out, unmute yourself, or drop it to the chat. But I think I'm sharing it. And my plan was really to quickly give you an idea of the plan for the week. So you have homework and you also have your second exam and second practical. And I know that it's a lot to put on you for 1 week, but consider it this way, that this is the second last time that you're going to be doing homework and an exam and practical on a same week. So you're really well past the midpoint of the semester. And these accelerated summer courses, they are intense, but I've followed very carefully everyone's grades. I've followed your work very carefully, and I think you're in a great place. Just don't give up. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. My other things that I was hoping to cover today was that we would have a quick kind of a mini summary of what the chapters that we were covering this week covered. So we'll be looking at chapter 11 and 10. And I know that it's a little confusing that it's kind of in a flipped around order, but basically I want to discuss a little bit about general stuff of muscles, and then I want to provide you some tools of how to approach learning all the skeletal muscles that we have. And there is a lot to cover. Having said that, I do think that it probably wouldn't be very wise use of our time unless I'm open to changing this to whatever you feel that would be most helpful for you. But I feel that it might not be the best use of our time if I just literally point out to a diagram and go through the body one muscle at a time. It is memorization, and that takes a fair bit of just effort as it is. Instead, I want to offer you kind of tools and tricks how to make this memorization a little bit easier. I also wanted to leave a door open that if anyone feels really, really strongly that they need help with the homework, we can totally look at that. But I think that usually just reviewing that chapter in this period of time that we have available kind of steals most of our time. But as always, if there are any specific things you want us to talk about, you want me to expand on, don't hesitate letting me know, and I'll be totally happy to change this plan. I'm kind of just in favor of having something planned out in case there's nothing specific that comes up. But before I go any further, the very, very, very first thing that I wanted to share with you is that I totally see the great work that's being done. I totally understand how intense this semester has been in terms of the amount of stuff that you're having to learn, take in, and then display through all of the homework assignments, and then actually reiterate through the tests. I realize that that's a lot. I'm really, really grateful for this class. I'm seeing some of the best work that I've seen being submitted on these classes. This is really a challenging class, and it's even more so a challenging class to do it at the twice of the speed of a normal class. And on top of that, doing it fully online. So there's a lot going on, and the fact that you're succeeding on this class is a huge merit. I would encourage all of my students who are taking these classes, and if you're ever having to talk about them, to reflect of them, I would encourage you to be very, very proud about that and very clear about that to wherever you're applying, whether it's academically for further studies or for employment, that the fact that you've done this in an accelerated format alone is a huge accomplishment, let alone the great grades that you are getting. So that was the kind of the first thing that I just wanted to start. I really do want you to know that I am grateful for you, and I'm grateful for the great work that's coming in. Having said that, also, if you ever have anything where you feel that I can help more, that is my job. That is a big part why I'm here. So I'm available to you in many different ways through these sessions, before these sessions, after these sessions. We can pause a recording if you don't want to talk about it on the public forum during the office hours, through messages, and so on and so on. I've tried this semester this on our online class, and it's been a little bit harder to do. Usually it is a little easier in a face-to-face class, but it's important for me that I always check in with my students, and there's many different ways how we can do it. So I just want you to know that feel free to share, but there's never requirement. So one of the ways that I thought that might be interesting, I do have an interesting book that I've gotten recently as a result of one of my professional developments. And normally students just shout out a page number to me and we have a look of it. But in the interest of time, I just picked up a random page number. And this is a quote that came up from Young Pueblo in his book, Inward. And it's, I gathered my habits and started releasing the ones that can never lead me to lasting freedom and joy. So I think there's many ways to read that quote and think of that quote, but I really think it reminds us in this class that capitalize on those things that are working for you. So the things that you feel that you're acing in this class, keep doing those. And if something's not working out for you, don't be hesitant to say that, hey, this isn't just the way I learn the best or the way I process the material the best. And we can try to find together solutions, and we can find alternative strategies. So I just think that there's some value in always pausing a little bit and having a look how to study. I've been a professional student for so many years that I feel that I really relate with that idea of finding what works for you. Here's the plan for this week. So this week, like I said, we have two new chapters that we're covering, chapter 11 and chapter 10. And for chapter 11, I do have a quiz and practice anatomy. And for chapter 10, I have a quiz and practice anatomy, and also one food for thought question. That food for thought question looks at a concept of what is it when you have pulled your hamstring. So you should have by this stage received a few already of these food for thought assignments back. So you'll see that I provide written feedback for every single student. And I also provide and that is individual feedback. And I also provide a grading rubric where I show how I came up with that grade that you accomplished. And one thing that many students are very quick to notice is that I really do give credit for answers that are demonstrating that student has put in extra effort. So you can gain a lot more points than the maximum number of points. So consider that as an extra credit. Typically, some of the things that yield high grades is, I think that if I were taking these assignments, I would look at the grading rubric while I'm answering to the question. So I would have an idea of what's expected for me. I always say that give the graders what they want. And I would also probably try to relate it to some of the experiences or things that you know from your own life. Those things always gain a lot of points. And really, I think that we're in academia very big on if you provide a reference, even greater. But just a simple one paragraph answer on the topic that addresses what you're being asked is more than sufficient. So I don't think I have anything new to say about food for thought. If everyone feels comfortable with that, I'm just going to move ahead. But if there are any questions, feel free to just jump in or drop the question to the chat. But it is the exact same as you've done before. And on this class, the grades have been really good for those. So that was the homework aspect of this week. In addition, this week we're doing the second set of tests. So we're doing the second exam and we're doing the second practical. And I know that doing all of that at the same time might feel like a lot, but consider it in a way that exam and practical really are you just applying everything you've done in your quizzes and practice anatomies. So there's nothing new you have to do for it. It's the similar stuff. So I have a little note here about the exam too, in terms of what to expect. We're covering 4 chapters on that. So we're looking at the skeleton. We're not going to go so much on the skeletal tissue. We covered that in the last exam, but we're looking at those bones. We're also looking at joints. We're looking at this week's material, the general introduction to the muscle tissue, and then we're looking at those major skeletal muscles that move the body. There's going to be 28 questions. So you'll notice that the number of questions is higher than on the first exam. And that's really because on the first exam, we didn't have that much material that we had covered already. So that's why now that we have more that we have covered, there's a few more questions. But for 28 questions, which are really closely aligned with what you've already completed in the quizzes, you have 60 minutes to complete them. So that is more than ample time. Typically, my students don't spend even half an hour with the test. So I don't have students who normally run out of the time, but the time is there because we need to make sure that no one takes multiple days or starts reading the textbook for the first time when they're taking an exam or so on. I would recommend, since it is an open book exam, it's not proctored, have those notes next to you, have those resources. Most of my students try to do the test without those, but knowing that that's there to support you and you can check if something comes up is normally settling the students' mind. They're not as panicky about taking the test. So like I said, make sure that you have everything next to you. It is a single sitting exam. So once you open that, that's when the 60 minutes starts running. If you were to have any technical problems with that, obviously then in that case, let me know and I'll reset your exam. So I have a sample question there of what to expect. These questions are going to be a mixture of multiple choice, true false statements, matching questions, ordering questions. That's sort of similar stuff that you've done before. And this first one is probably a little more intense than some of the other questions that we have on the exam. But the first one asks you to match the specific bone that I'm mentioning with the region of the body where that bone is being found. So for example, we see for the frontal bone, that's part of the skull, sternum, so our chest bone, part of the thoracic cage, scapula, we're seeing the shoulder blade as part of the pectoral girdle, bones there, hip bone, part of the pelvis, ribs, part of the thoracic cage, clavicle, so our collarbone. Again, from the options that I'm offering you there, I would associate it mostly with pectoral girdle. Maxilla, the bone goes to the bones of the skulls. Sacrum, pelvis would be the most correct or closest to the correct ones of the options that I have on that drop-down menu for you, and costal cartilages, those cartilages that connect your ribs to the sternum, would be most related to the thoracic cage. So that's probably as hard as it gets. So you'll have an idea based on that. But like I said, and many of the questions are multiple choice. Many of the questions are true false questions. So this was a little more laborsome question than some of the others that you see. But again, use your notes. Check what you have done for the quizzes, because the questions are very, very similar to that. And don't stress over it. I really am not here to catch you out. This exam is worth 100 points, so that gives you an idea that you collect those points with all of the assignments that you do for homeworks as well, but doing these exams is worth it. I do though say to my students that remember, if you have that 91%, that is the highest letter grade that you're going to get, then you're going to get the A. So 91 or higher, or I think it's 90 or higher percentages will get you an A. And unfortunately, I can't give you more than an A. We don't have A++ that we can give to the students as a final grade. So keep collecting those points, take those points, because that's that much less points that you have to worry at the end of the semester to collect. So that was all I had on mind about the exam. I also wanted to mention a couple of words about the practical. Practical covers the same chapters as the major bones, a few questions about the joints, a few things about general muscle tissue, and especially then the major skeletal muscles. And that's going to include 50 questions, and that might sound like a lot, but it really is very quick to tackle those questions. So those questions, again, align very closely to what you've done in your practice anatomy homeworks. And the example that we have on the screen here is a very good representation. So there is a picture, and then I'm pointing something in that picture, and I'm asking you, what is this? I'm asking you to identify it, and I'll give you some options what it could be, and you choose the correct option. So really, I think that it takes for most students about 10 seconds to answer per question. So you have 60 minutes for that. You will not run out of time. You even have time to check some of the questions if you feel like, oh, I've kind of forgotten this topic. These questions add up to 50 points. And again, it's taken in a single setting, non-proctored open book format. So have those notes next to you. You will probably know the answer immediately, but just having that option to check anything that comes up. Again, we do have that time limit there just so that someone doesn't, for the very first time in their life, Googling these questions if they've not done any homework. But as before, please do not stress. I'm not here to catch you out, and I will totally promise that it is very, very closely aligned to what you've already done in your previous work. So I don't know, I feel I went through those a little quick, and I want to make sure that if you have any concerns or any questions about either the homework or the tests, that we will get those answered before I jump in to reviewing the weekly chapter material. But I just want to take a moment. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to unmute yourself and just let me know or drop the question to the chat. If you feel shy of doing so, you can do so also at the end of the session. I'll stop recording, or I can even pause recording now. But I'll pause just for a second in case anyone has any questions about homework or the tests that we're doing this week. I'm not hearing anything coming through, so I assume that everything is well then. Usually no news is good news in that sense. So what I was gonna do, I was gonna provide that kind of a nutshell review of the lecture material that I was intending for you to cover this week. I'm gonna make the screen full-sized because I have few things where I was hoping to draw things with you and so on the screen just to illustrate few points. So I'll make it bigger, but if you have any questions at any stage, just jump in and we'll take it from there. And I'm also gonna just close few screens that I have here. So if you have a message in the chat and I fail to notice that, just shout out to me about that. So we were starting with looking at the muscle tissue in a general level before we dived into specific skeletal muscles. So almost half of the body mass is really dedicated by the muscular system. So it's going to be a really important system for us to have a look of. And one way to think about the muscular system, I guess, is to consider that its function is to convert chemical energy. So the energy that you have extracted from the food and converted it into ATP on a cellular level, we're converting that ATP now into mechanical movement. So the really big purpose of this muscular system is to generate movement. There are other purposes, but it is kind of like if I were to ask, what is the overview purpose that we're trying to accomplish with this system? What I was planning to do was that we'll look at different types of muscle tissues. We'll discuss quickly about different characteristics of muscle tissue and also have a look of the muscle functions. So that's kind of the skeleton for that chapter 11, what I had on mind. Interestingly, the term muscle comes from Latin. We saw that at the early parts of this course that a lot of Greek and Latin words are behind the terminology that we see in anatomy and physiology, actually standing for little mouse, so Latin word. But it really, I think that was just a curiosity, but we see that there's something very tiny structures behind the muscles that can then end up being large structures and very, very important for us. So we'll study muscle in all scales today. I did quickly want to remind you, and I think that this is revision from what you've covered on your introductory classes. I wanted to remind you of the 3 types of muscle tissue that we had. And I wanted to look at those on a cellular level, just very quickly as a kind of a review. So with the skeletal muscle, one of the things that we saw was that these were typically these kind of cylinder-shaped muscles. These had multiple nuclei, and these nuclei are typically located kind of more on the edges of these skeletal muscle cells. And we'll also see that skeletal muscle cells typically had striations. So we'll discuss about what causes this striation for the skeletal muscle in just a few moments, but sometimes my students get really confused. They ask, how can a single cell have multiple nuclei? And that really can be attributed to the fact that during the development of the skeletal muscle cells, we're seeing multiple muscle cells fusing together. So that's really where the explanation for the multinucleated appearance of a skeletal muscle comes from. So like I said, cylinder in shape, typically multiple nuclei and striations. Those would be the big things to take away when we talk about what does a skeletal muscle look like. And it's going to be the skeletal muscles that our main focus on this course will be. You'll get to see other types of muscles, such as cardiac muscle on your BIO202, which I also teach, we'll focus on those specific muscle cells when we talk about the heart a little more. Smooth muscle we'll see, for example, when we talk about blood vessels, structures within the intestines, and so on. But skeletal muscle is where our main focus is today. Really quickly, I do though want to mention about cardiac muscle cells. So cardiac muscle cells are typically branched muscle cells. So they connect to multiple other muscle cells. And at these branches that they have this very special adaptation that we see, and we call that intercalated disc. What intercalated discs at the end of the cardiac muscle cells do, they really facilitate easy passage of materials and messages from one muscle cell to another. So if you think of the function of the cardiac muscle tissue, we really want it to contract all at once. We don't want cells doing their own thing here and there. So it is this coordinated contraction of the cardiac muscle tissue that we can accomplish thanks to these intercalated discs. Cardiac muscle cells typically have one central nucleus, and they as well will have striations that we can see on a microscopic level. So I think that those are the biggest things that I wanted to highlight about cardiac muscle cells on this microscopic level. Obviously, you will see multiple cardiac muscle cells then coming together, forming those cardiac muscle tissues. But like I said, if you want to just take key points, remember that these are branched cells. They connect to multiple other cells. Because of having these many branches, they have these intercalated discs, special adaptations at the end of these cells, and the purpose of that was the easy passage of materials and messages, one central nucleus, and striations that we find in them. So I think that that's a good kind of an overview of a cardiac muscle cell. One thing that I might add is that whereas skeletal muscles are under voluntary control, you can choose when you move a big skeletal muscle. These are the muscles that generate the movements in our body that we think of and that we'll be studying. Cardiac muscle cells are involuntary. You don't have to think that I'm going to have a heartbeat now. It just happens. And final muscle cell type that I wanted to mention is going to be our smooth muscle. These are really just small blobs that have one central nucleus but not striations. When they contract, they might look a little different, but they're not, in terms of the microscopy, a terribly exciting cell type to study. They're kind of a simple, so there's not a lot to memorize. Just kind of a more of a spindle-shaped or rounded in shape, depending on what you catch the smooth muscle cell doing. And like I said, no striations and one central nucleus. So that was the kind of basic introduction to the three muscle cell types that I wanted to just remind you of. But we will be focusing on the skeletal muscle, and that's our main focus now. When we're talking about the muscles, we can associate four main characteristics for the muscle. This is the only body tissue type with these properties, these four properties. So we often describe muscles as being excitable, or irritable. So what I mean by that these muscle tissues, they respond to stimuli. So we can pass a stimuli to that, and that causes then some kind of a response. Other thing that we often think of or describe muscle tissues with is that they're contractile. By this, I mean that they shorten, so they contract when they get stimulated. Having said that, I do need to make a point, because sometimes this might be a thing that gets misunderstood, that we do have times when muscles are still working, even if they're not lengthening. So for example, if you take a really heavy weight, like a gallon bottle of water, and you just hold it, and your muscle is not really doing any lengthening, it's just holding it, that muscle is still working to hold that weight. So that contractile sometimes confuses students in that sense. Muscles are characterized also being extensible. So by that, I mean that they can be stretched in response to force. And I think that a lot of things like yoga rely on this kind of exercise. Final thing that I wanted to mention here was that muscle tissues typically are described as being having elasticity. So they recoil, they return to their original resting length when the force strengthening it is removed. So I go through this, but sometimes students are left with a little bit of feeling that, okay, what am I supposed to take away from that? Really, I guess that I just want to say that muscle is a very specific type of tissue, and that's why we're approaching it separately. But by no means this is not the most important thing that I'll say today. Other thing that I wanted to mention really quickly, and this is kind of leading us to what we'll be doing when we look at those major skeletal muscles that we find in the body, is that sometimes giving wrong kinds of instructions to a person who's working on their muscular system can be really, really dangerous. So instructing a patient in an exercise that does not follow the line of the pull will be less effective and could actually place additional stress on a damaged tissues if we have a physical therapist, for example, who doesn't take care of that good training practice. So really it is important that if you are doing weight training, if you're trying to manipulate your muscles, that you have an understanding what you're trying to accomplish with that. And I guess that one way to think of that my students sometimes ask is that, how do I know a good personal trainer from a bad personal trainer? I'm not here to badmouth anyone, but I think that hearing a personal trainer talking about things such as core strength is a really good sign. We start with that before we start bulking up and doing these other things. Kind of going to that wrong technique, I did want to mention another thing, and I do have a picture that might be, if you're really squeamish, you can look away for the next minute or so. But one thing that we see with training muscles as well is that muscles often come in pairs, and if you train only one group or one muscle of this pair, you can actually cause more damage than good. We've seen this especially in elite athletes who train intensely, and if they train without understanding of this, which muscles go together, or without support system, support team that guides them in their training, that you can overtrain certain muscles. If they don't have the opposing muscle group, serious damage can occur, as we've seen, for example, here in a runner who literally nothing else happened, but the muscles on one side of the leg were just too powerful that the bone gave in. There was no fault, there was nothing else. So we do see those occasionally. I think we see less of those these days. I think we have a much better situation in a sense that people don't just train without guidance. But here it was the issue of imbalance of the muscle pairs that were being trained. So I guess that's kind of what I wanted to say about that. I did want to talk a little bit about the functions of the muscular system. And there's multiple functions. And if we think of the major functions, there's 4 that I came up with. And muscles, well, the first and most obvious thing that I think many of us think of is that muscles are there to generate movement. They produce movement. So we're really changing the we're doing the locomotion, we're moving the individual thanks to our muscle system, and manipulation of things that around us that we can engage with also relies greatly on the muscles. So anything from walking, digestion, pumping blood, we're generating movement with the muscles. Second thing that I wanted to highlight when it comes to the muscle functions was that really even staying still, standing still on in a room is actually work. So maintaining the posture and body position, that is something where we're constantly using muscles to adjust, for example, for our balance. I often ask my students in a class to stand up and stand on one leg, and we're not going to do it now, but you would see that just staying still, standing up on one leg, it's a lot of work, and muscles are doing fine adjustments in collaboration with the nervous system to maintain your balance, keep you standing up. In addition to that, muscles stabilize joints. So this is where we're seeing that there's a reason why we paired up the skeletal system and muscular system, that these two systems go together, because a lot of the time what we're doing to generate movements is that we have muscles that run over joints, and it is really these muscles acting on the joints that generate the movement. But similarly, if you have a joint and you're keeping it in a certain angle, it's not the joint itself that's maintaining that angle, it's the muscles acting on that joint that keep the joints shape or how it's positioned. Final one that I wanted to mention about the four functions is that we've seen also that whenever you convert chemical energy into another, or any form of energy into another form of energy, there's going to be some loss of energy, and typically that's in shape of a heat. So we see this in muscular system, for example, when you're exercising, when you're doing a lot of that conversion of chemical energy into movement, as a byproduct, you will be producing heat. So you start to get warm, your temperature comes up, think of going to the gym. So you need to be somewhere where there's air circulation, you might drink something cold and so on. But we can also use this to our advantage. So when you're in a cold room, it's not really that you have to move to get around that room. Just getting shivers is muscles working, and we get those muscles to work so that as they're working, we're producing heat to bring up your body temperature. So those were the major functions of the muscle. There are other additional ones. For example, many muscles are round organs, protect organs, forming different kinds of restrictions for movements. I'm thinking, for example, digestive system, kind of various sphincters that control the movement of material along there. Even as small things as on your eye, controlling the pupil size, there's muscles involved. You saw last week goosebumps, some of the smallest muscles in the body, erector pili, that lifted your hair up. So muscles come in many shapes and forms and sizes. I guess that's what I'm trying to say by that. Continuing onwards, let's have a look at the skeletal muscles a little bit more. In males, about 42% of the body mass is made of skeletal muscles. I think in females, it's about 36%. So there's a little bit of a difference, largely driven by testosterone, that gives a little greater ability to enlarge the muscle fibers on the males, but obviously, these are averages. We have individual variations, and by training your skeletal muscles, you can do significant muscle mass growth fairly quickly. That's one of the nice things about starting training if you haven't trained before, that you can quickly see large changes with a lot of training. So with skeletal muscle, previously we have talked about the skeletal muscle tissue, but now let's consider those as an organs. So what I wanted to do here was really to go probably to a little bit more microscopic scale and show that muscles are made of smaller parts, smaller structures. So muscles, these big blobs that you see, are made of fascicles, and these individual fascicles. So in this picture, we're zooming in each time we're moving to the right and bottom corner. These individual fascicles then are made of smaller individual muscle fibers. So we can zoom in and in and in to the smaller scale, and we finally are left by looking at a single muscle fiber. So I think that that's going to be something that we want to spend a little bit of time. When we talk about the attachments of the muscles, one of the things that some instructors are really passionate about, they talk greatly about insertion and origin of the muscle. I really think that we probably, as long as we can kind of appreciate that muscle typically has to be attached at least in two parts, so that as it contracts, we can generate a movement. I think we're on a good path. I have some debate whether the insertion and origin is kind of an old-fashioned way of looking at that. We want to know really the bigger message, which is that muscles work as levelers. So if you've ever tried to pick up a heavy rock, you've noticed that if you use a stick to do that's on this pivot point, you can actually amplify the force that you would be generating to move it. So that's why having these levelers is a concept that we also see in the body, that a muscle might be acting on fingers, but the actual muscle is not located on finger, it's located further up on the arm. So we're seeing these levelers in various places and various structures of the body. I guess that really this brings us to that origin and insertion discussion, in a sense that this applies to how far apart those two structures are, and that really would go into a field of articulation biomechanics. So if that's something interesting, that you're interested, you can combine anatomy and physiology with engineering as well. That's one way to look at this. I did want to mention a few words about these skeletal muscle fibers, and these were these long cylinder cells that contained multiple nuclei. We saw those just earlier on. Let's zoom in and study a single myofibril. They're made of myofibrils. So let's have a look of those. Those are located within the sacraluma. This is the membrane around the muscle fiber. And here we're zooming in. So what we're seeing and what I want to focus is a single sarcomere that we're seeing here. It runs from one Z line from another. So we can see these repeated patterns within the myofibrils. What I want us to notice here is this concept that these striations that I mentioned earlier on are actually explained by the arrangement of microscopic stuff that we see when we zoom in to the muscle. So we will end up seeing that these sarcomeres are made of actins and myosin filaments. These are specific types of filaments, and where we have them packed in thicker matter, that's going to show up as dark, whereas where we have lesser of that, so light has easier time to pass through it, that's going to show up as brighter. So this is really the explanation why we see dark and bright striations in certain muscles. And I just wanted to show a electron microscopy image there to try to convince you that these actins and myosin filaments really do exist. But let's have a look of the actin and myosin a little bit more. So how actin and myosin work is that they can move in relation to each other on this smaller scale. And as the muscle lengthens, these slide past each other, and when muscle shortens, they come closer together. So you can almost think of these in our example that we're seeing here, these myosin filaments, almost like having little legs that travel in relation to this blue actin, and this way can change the length of the muscle. So H zone, this area where we have a lot of material, light is going to have a hard time penetrating through it. So that's going to show up as a dark band, whereas then these Z discs, where we have less for the light to penetrate through, they are going to show up as a light band. So that's how you get that striation appearance. We could go into great detail of what causes a muscle to contract. So there is going to be neuromuscular junction, so a neural signal that triggers that. And I think your textbook goes into pretty good detail about that, so I'm going to keep it very general here in the interest of time, but it is this nerve impulse that travels down the nerve cell to an end to the action terminal, and then the chemicals are released. They're not actually connected physically. There's a small gap, and these chemicals are released into this synapses. Typically, I think acetylcholine is the important one here, and this can then cause a change in the flow of calcium. That causes the muscle to contract. We'll spend more time talking about, when we talk about nervous system, on the last chunk of chapters on this course. We'll spend more time talking about neurons and action terminals and synapses and all that. But what I wanted to show here, and what I kind of always keep coming back, is that we find calcium in a lot of places in the body. So calcium is really, really important, and calcium is important also when it comes to explaining why after death we get something called rigor mortis. And I initially had pictures here, but I don't want to get into trouble with anyone, so I'm not going to show you pictures of dead people. If you're really curious, we can have a look of those once I've stopped recording. But rigor mortis stands for rigid death in Latin. And this is the stiffening of the muscles that we find starting a few hours after death and lasting anywhere from 1 to 4 days. And what really causes that is that we're seeing these myosin heads being bound to actin because of this calcium, and that causes this constant state of contraction. So it almost looks like body is frozen in place, and it starts first from the smallest of muscles and typically spreads from the heads to toes direction. But these individuals, these dead people who are in rigor mortis state, you can literally hold them from the feet and head, and they will remain as a flat sheet. The joints don't give up, the muscles don't give up. So we really do see this rigor mortis. So like I said, if you're interested on that, we can talk about that once the recording is over, but I didn't want to get into trouble by showing pictures of that. And that brings us to the next chapter. And in the next chapter, what you're going to be seeing is the main skeletal muscles of the body. So I provided, based on the feedback I got last week, blank diagrams and then diagrams with labels if you find it easier to study these muscles with those. I think one of the challenges with using diagrams is that we don't get really well that kind of depth of muscles. So there's muscle layered on top of another muscle on top of another muscle. So sometimes these diagrams kind of lose that three-dimensionality. So I provided you a few videos where I actually build up all of the major muscles of the body from clay on a skeleton. So that might help with that. I think it's a great useful activity when students build those muscles themselves, because you kind of get the three-dimensionality as well rather than a flat diagram. I would encourage you, if you're struggling with this or finding it tricky, you do have those learning centers available from the college where you can go and find muscle models and whole models of the body with all the muscles. So if that's something that you feel that would be useful for you, I absolutely encourage you to do that as well. But like I said, rather than going through individual muscle by muscle of this diagram, which probably would be rather boring for you to watch, I figured that what we would do, we would come up with some of the big rules or kind of important concepts that will help you more to learn these muscles. So when you're learning muscles, I think that really it is useful to pay attention to the muscle's name, because that muscle's name might give you a lot of information about not just what it does, but where it's located and what type of it is in terms of the muscle. Really, when you're studying these muscles, don't just look at a diagram and be like, I'm just going to learn that this muscle here is this. Think of what it does. That often is super helpful to relate the function of the muscle as well to studying it. So you'll be able to figure that out if you think where the muscle starts, where it ends, where are the attachment points. Often students find it helpful also to act out the movements that those particular muscles might do. So those are some tips or hints that might be helpful. When we're naming skeletal muscles, I think the name, like I said, gives us a lot of clue about them. So if you have a muscle that the name gives you a clue about the location, that might be convenient. So this is where, having spent all that time learning those bones or having learned different body regions, is really starting to pay off for you. So for example, temporalis muscle, and I can't see it because I've got something else on top of there on this picture, but temporalis muscle is over the temporal bone. So that kind of gives you an idea where to place that muscle. Sometimes the muscle's name tells you about the shape of the muscle. For example, deltoid refers to a delta, which is a triangular shape. So deltoid is this triangular muscle that we find. I think it's from Greek word for deltoides, but I might be wrong. Size can often be found out from the skeletal muscle name as well. So if we have many muscles that are alike, often that might be helpful in the name to separate those alike muscles when you get the clue of the size. So gluteus maximus, the largest muscle of the buttocks. We also have gluteus minimus and gluteus longus, I think, as well. So we see a few different versions, but the maximus tells us that it's the especially large one. Sometimes the muscle name also gives you information about the fiber direction that we find in this muscle. So for example, how the fibers run in this muscle. So for example, rectus refers to that these fibers are running straight. So rectus abdominis, the straight muscle fibers of the abdominal region. We might have muscle fibers in a name that tell us that they are transversus, so running in a transverse angle, or oblique, running in this kind of a weird angle that doesn't align with the three planes that we've been learning earlier on. Sometimes the muscle's name tells us about the number of origins, how many endings and starts that muscle has. So for example, biceps brachii has 2 ends, whereas triceps has 3 ends. So again, that name gives you a good clue of that. a lot of the time we end up seeing with the muscles that the name tells us about the attachment points that it has. So for example, where the locations where these muscles connect to whether it's an origin or insertion. So for example, sternocleidomastoid is a good one that we see here. So running from the sternum to the clavicle and connecting to the mastoid process of the skull. So it's kind of this muscle that forms almost like a triangular shape. So we are listing all of the locations where that muscle attaches to. In terms of the action, I think that we can name the action that the muscle produces, whether it's a flexor or extension. So flexion refers that we're reducing the angle between two parts of a joint, whereas extension means that we're adding to that angle, we're making it bigger, that angle. So flexion, bringing that angle, decreasing that angle. Sometimes we also see multiple of these characteristics being put together in a name of a muscle. So for example, extensor carpi radialis longus tells us that it extends at the level of the wrists, connecting at the radius, and it is a really long muscle. So there's a lot that we get from that name as well. Other way how muscles and learning them can sometimes be useful is to pay attention, like I said, to that fascicle arrangement, what direction those fibers run. So here's some of the most common arrangements. So circular refers that they are these kind of rounded arrangement of the muscle fibers, such as around orbicularis oris. Around the mouth, we see this ring shape. We also see the same around orbicularis oculi, around the eye. We can have also fascicle muscle fiber arrangement where we describe it as convergent. By that I mean that there's a broad origin that then converges into one, so kind of comes into one spot. I think pec major would be a good, pectoralis major would be a good example of that. What I mean by fusiform, I mean that these are spindle-shaped muscles, muscle fiber arrangement, where we have these parallel fibers that then fuse into one, or at both ends or at one end. So I think that biceps brachii is a good example here. We can also have parallel fiber arrangement where these parallel fibers run kind of regularly next to each other. We see very little convergence there at the ends. Sartorius would be a good example of that, the big muscle at the low, connecting the lower limb to the hips. Pennate is a kind of an umbrella term that we see when the fibers attach to a central tendon, and we can have unipennate or bipennate or multipennate, depending on how many attachments we get there. So I think that that's all I was going to say in terms of revising the chapter material. Like I said, I do realize that one of the things that we have overlooked is that we didn't go through individual muscles one by one, but I did actually prepare, like I said, that on our Canvas course. You should have good material there. Let me just pull up that so we can see together when you go to this week's chapter material, you should be able to find really rather good blank and with answers, the muscles of the body. So that might be handy tool, but work through those practice anatomies. I think that they're the most useful tool that you can find in terms of helping you to study along and practice what you're learning. So on that note, I'm jumping back to the PowerPoint presentation. Like I said, I want to be mindful of the time. And what we've done so far, we've had a look of the homework, we've had a look of what's coming up with the tests, we had a quick review of the chapter material, and if someone's interested, I am happy to look at the homework, but it really is very similar as you've seen so far. At this point, I guess that the better thing for me to do would be really to create the room for checking if you have any questions, if there's anything you feel that we haven't covered and you like to cover, anything that may make you confused or you kind of want to check on. This is the time and space for that. I'm going to stick around, but if you don't have any questions, if you feel that you're kind of in a good place, that's all I have for today. I will remind you just real quickly that the college is closed on Tuesday for the Independence Day. I think a lot of people are taking Monday off, but I am working on, however, working on a committee assignment. So I'll try to make sure that I still offer the office hours, but there is a chance that I have to cancel those. If that happens to be, I would notify you. And obviously, I don't offer them on Tuesday since I'm not going to be around. I also wanted to put a really quick blog to mention it, and I will provide further details. I just don't have the details yet. But my face-to-face class that I'm teaching this summer has been very, very eager and asking if we could organize a field trip as a class. And that field trip is going to go to see our mortuary science department. So we offer in this college also a degree in mortuary science. So working towards that kind of a field. So I'm organizing a trip for this group to our Williams campus. It's probably gonna be not next week, but the following week. And I think I'm looking at the moment of Tuesday. So I think it's 11th. The day is 11th, and I'm looking to do it early part of the day. So in the morning, probably from 8 to 11-ish, midday-ish. I will provide details of that for anyone who wants to join us, but that is not expected, that is not required. But since I'm doing it with the rest of my students, I do want you not to feel that you're losing out. So I will extend you an invitation to that trip and provide you with details how to join us once I have those ready. Just keep an eye of the announcements. Like I said, not required, not something you have to do, but just in case if you want to interact with other students, if you want to see what our nursing division does, if you want to see what mortuary science does, or just in general what our Williams campus does. I'm not quite sure what we're going to do exactly where we're getting to visit, but we have, for example, aviation program at the Williams campus. Sometimes I manage to sneak in my students to see what they do in that program. And that's pretty cool because we're right next to an airport and they do amazing stuff with airplanes. So if that's something that you're interested, you're more than welcome to join us. Like I said, I will provide all the details to you through announcements, but that is not required. That is not going to impact your grade. That is not something that is going to impact your chances of getting into other programs. It's just an additional thing that I like to do with my students. So I'll provide the details probably in the next few days about that on the announcements. That's all I had for today. If you're gonna be heading to other things, if you have places to be, things to do, I realize it's a late evening, I'll let you go. Remember that even though it's a lot this week, you're almost at the finish line. So let's finish off strong. I'll stick around. I'll stop the recording and I'll stick around. If you have any questions, we can tackle those. But that's all I had planned for today. Have a good night.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you. And that concludes also our recording for this week's live online session. Like I said, don't feel, even if you're unable to join on these live online sessions, that you wouldn't have access for direct communication. I do offer a lot of uh, office hours, so we can have one-on-one chats during those. You can always message me. I encourage you to use the Canvas. Those messages reach me a little bit better. And you also can just message me and we'll find a time when we can do this direct interaction if you have anything that I can help you with. But really the biggest thing on these online classes is just keep collecting those points, get those good points, get the grade that you want, and you'll be quickly realizing that you're already almost at the finish line. So that's going to conclude our session today. I hope you have a good week, and don't hesitate to reach out to me if there's anything I can help you with. Thank you. Bye.